Getting closer and closer to Joint Base Andrews. Momentarily, it will arrive. There will be a formal departure ceremony for the 41st President of the United States, whose casket will be brought aboard that plane, that presidential aircraft, to take the whole entourage, the family, including the casket, to Houston, Texas, where there'll be, Jake, another memorial service tomorrow morning before final burial at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M University.
That's right, and there are different contingencies of organizations from George H.W. Bush's life that are at Joint Base Andrews right now, individuals from the U.S. Secret Service, individuals from the Points of Life Foundation. We're told that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, will lead the honor guard there, along with the chiefs and chairs of every branch of military service. There will also be a performance of Going Home that will be played by the Air Force Band that was chosen by George H.W. Bush himself. One other note, Willie Geist just tweeted this. John Meacham, the reporter and historian who wrote that powerful biography of George H.W. Bush and just was one of the four men who eulogized the former president at the National Cathedral service. Meacham had an opportunity to read his eulogy to George H.W. Bush, obviously in the preceding months. And the response, according to what Meacham told Geist, is George H.W. Bush said, "That's a lot about me, John." Which of course it is. It's a eulogy for a former president. Of course it's going to be, but that gets at the humility and modesty of the man that we've been hearing so much about. And here we have the procession, the motorcade, arriving at Joint Base Andrews.
Jeff Zeleny, our White House correspondent, is there at Joint Base Andrews. The presidential hearse is there. The motorcade has arrived, but this is the advance that we're seeing right now. But momentarily, we will see the presidential hearse, and everyone is getting ready. What are you seeing on the scene for us, Jeff?
Well, Wolf, we are seeing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other chairmen of the different branches of service arriving here in their motorcade. They will be taking their position on a chilly and windy tarmac here at Joint Base Andrews. You can also see the Air Force Band is in position, as well as the color guard. They will be receiving, again, the casket of George H.W. Bush. We also have several invited guests, former Secret Service agents. You'll remember George H.W. Bush had 12 years of Secret Service agents, of course, and continuing on to, he went out of office as vice president, as president, so many of them here. But Wolf, we're also told there is going to be, of course, Hail to the Chief one final time, but the song Going Home. That is a familiar hymn, a favorite of President Bush's, Dvorak song, and the lyrics are quite poignant. And this is indeed will be the final trip home of hundreds, if not thousands, of trips aboard Air Force One, aboard Air Force Two, and other planes here that he has taken throughout his long life of service. So he'll be, of course, at destination Ellington Field in Texas as they arrive here, but one more ceremony on the ground here before he is sent off.
We're told, Jeff, the motorcade has now arrived at Joint Base Andrews, and this formal departure ceremony is about to begin. There will be full honors, of course, rendered, and as you point out, once again, ruffles and flourishes. Hail to the chief, a full presidential send-off for the 41st President of the United States. You see the top military brass. They have gathered there to pay their respects to George H.W. Bush himself, a World War II hero who volunteered for the U.S. military at the age of 18. On the day he turned 18, fought in World War II, and the military clearly paying their respects for this extraordinary person. We learned a lot, even at this stage, Jake, in those eulogies that we just heard. There were nuggets there that were new.
There was a lot of information, and obviously these were four people that knew the former president quite well. His biographer, a fellow world leader, former senator who worked closely with him, and then, of course, his oldest son. Much of it was about the dignity of the man, his grace, his modesty, his humility, his insistence on treating everyone like you would want to be treated. A lot of values that make people wonder where they are in Washington today. You know, Alan Simpson referred to the high road of humility in Washington is not a road that is often besieged with traffic or words along those lines. And yet George H.W. Bush, even in that anecdote from John Meacham about reading his eulogy to the former president before he delivered it, obviously, reveals that. That's a lot about me, he said. It's a lesson that he was taught by his mother, who always told him to avoid the big I ams. Don't talk about yourself. It's something that some of his aides and advisors think might have hurt him politically. His refusal to go to Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, his refusal to participate in a ticker tape parade in Manhattan after the success and victory in the first Gulf War. A man who obviously had a healthy sense of self, being a president at the time, but somebody who did not like gushing about himself, liked having the light shine on others, as one of his eulogers put it.
And I noticed, and I want to get your thoughts, that when President Bush walked in, he went over to the former presidents and the former first ladies, shook their hands, went down the aisle, thanked them for coming, and it seemed to, you know, there you see that when he was arriving there, it was a beautiful gesture, I thought, on his part.
It was, and as I said before, I mean, he really is now the patriarch of this Bush family, this Bush dynasty, a family that started with his grandfather, Prescott Bush, who was a senator from Connecticut, that was then assumed by his father, George H.W. Bush, not the oldest son of Prescott Bush, but the one who assumed the leadership role in the family, and now it falls to Bush 43. So that didn't surprise me. It was a nice gesture, him shaking the hands of the four formers that were there, Trump, Obama, Clinton, and Carter, thanking them for being there on behalf of the Bush family.
Yeah, and it was nice that everyone was there to participate. This is what George H.W. Bush wanted.
It was, and obviously it's a little different than other big funerals we've had this year. The funeral of former First Lady Barbara Bush in, I believe, was it February or April, perhaps? In April. The funeral of Senator John McCain. Events where not all of the presidents were there, notably, of course, the current president, Donald Trump, not invited to McCain's, and he did not attend Barbara Bush's. And
you know, when he got there, you know, he shook hands, President Trump, with Michelle Obama and former President Obama, but there was nothing else beyond that.
Yeah, and a lot of people reading a lot into that about Hillary Clinton not looking at President Trump. Why didn't President Trump shake this person's hand? Why didn't this person shake President Trump's hand? That's probably for another time and place to have that discussion, but obviously a lot of tensions in that pew, things that have been said, and obviously, look, there are a lot of tensions between the Bush family and President Trump.
There's the presidential hearse arriving at Joint Base Andrews. I want to go back to our White House correspondent, Jeff Zeleny, who's there on the scene. Jeff, this formal departure ceremony is about to begin.
It is, Wolf. We are seeing the motorcade, as you can see here, the hearse there with those two American flags, as well as that poignant presidential seal, followed by members of the Bush family. Of course, President George W. Bush and Laura Bush are directly behind the hearse, as well as other family members, as you can see, filing through there. They will be taking their place on this windy tarmac here at Joint Base Andrews, and they will, of course, be having one more ceremony. This indeed is one of the key stops. We will see the casket again being taken out of the hearse and loaded onto Air Force One. And I'm also told that similar to other presidents like Ronald Reagan when he flew back to California, this casket of George H.W. Bush will be placed in the staff cabin of Air Force One, allowing family members time to say goodbye again as he flies and his remains fly to Texas. But we are seeing now the family. I can see President Bush just not too many feet in front of me, looking out the window at this scene unfolding here. The family members will be waiting inside in their cars for a moment as they get into position here, Wolf. But again, the flags whipping in the breeze, a a poignant moment out here again as George H.W. Bush takes his final leave from Andrews Air Force Base. The family now filing out of these buses and getting ready to hear "Hail to the Chief" and the 21-gun salute. Wolf?
Full military honors for the 41st President of the United States. And this presidential aircraft, it's very symbolic because President Bush 41 would fly in this Air Force One, this plane, as he was President of the United States. It was the first Air Force One that he used as President of the United States. It's now, Jake, I think it's got a special name now, Special Air Mission 41.
Right.
They're calling it, they don't call it, only if a current sitting president is aboard that presidential aircraft is it called Air Force One.
And look, this is a man who traveled the world on behalf of the United States in any manner of capacity. He was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He headed the mission to China before the U.S. even had an official U.S. ambassador there. He served as head of the CIA. He served as vice president for 8 years, during a period of which he would joke about how often vice presidents were dispatched to international funerals. I think he quipped something along the lines of, if you die, I'll fly, something like that. And then, of course, as president, and a president heavily focused on international relations, no less than his 1988 opponent, Mike Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts, praising how he was, how wise he was as a president focused on international relations. There's his son, George W. Bush, the 43rd president, here for the final goodbye here in Washington. He's there with General Michael Howard, who's head of the command here in D.C., which includes the Honor Guard.
The family, all the family now on the tarmac, getting ready for this final departure ceremony. They'll be boarding this plane and heading off to Houston with the casket, of course. There will be more state funeral services tomorrow in Houston, and then followed by the burial at Texas A&M University, where the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library is based.
And look how George W. Bush, the 43rd president, is becoming, right before our eyes, the patriarch of the Bush family. When he came here earlier in the week and walked on the tarmac, that very same tarmac, with his brothers. He was the oldest brother of children that had come to bury their father and grieve their father, mourn their father. And today, leading that coterie of Bushes, he is the patriarch of the family, the head of the family.
It's another moment, and it's another emotional moment, and I just want to listen in and watch.
boarding the aircraft now. The flight should be about 3 or 4 hours to Houston, and then for the burial tomorrow. It is remarkable, it just feels like they came here just a few days ago. I mean, there's been so much that has taken place just over the last several days now to see them all as a family getting back on this plane and heading home.
And the personal tomorrow to the home chapel in Houston, then the burial. This has been the presidential part, if you will, of the farewell to their father, to the Bush family, their father who happened to be president, but most of all their father. And so now they're back to Texas, his adopted home state, the state that was so important to him. Just to watch the family get on this plane. The 747s came in as Air Force One during the George H.W. Bush presidency. He flew around the world, obviously, at a tumultuous time in them. His son used this plane as well when he was president. You see George W. Bush going up the steps right there. There's 2 of them, so I'm not sure if this is the one. George W. Bush, I went with him on a secret trip to Baghdad once, and he wanted to fly Air Force One, the 747, into Baghdad at that precarious moment, because it is the symbol of American might and democracy and glory. And it's an amazing plane. It's a privilege to cover the White House and travel with presidents. And it's pretty cool when you go to a foreign capital and people look at that plane. And so for a president, George H.W. Bush, who had domestic achievements as well, but who is better known for managing the world at an incredibly tumultuous time, a final flight home on what has become a symbol of American might in some ways, but also that flag on the back, American democracy. It's pretty cool.
I couldn't help but see a little bit of relief, particularly on Laura Bush's face. As you know, she has been standing next to her husband, literally propping him up for the last few days. Her arm under his arm the entire time. And for the first time now, I saw her relax a little bit. He had given his eulogy. This difficult part, returning to Washington, was coming to an end, and now they were taking, they were taking H.W. home, and they were all returning home, and I could just see the difference in her, and even in him, that they wanted this to go off so well, and it did for them. I think just the way Bush 41 had wanted it and had planned it, and I think that hearing the last ruffles and flourishes, and that's so emotional. And now back to living. And I think they were holding their breath for days here. And now they were exhaling a little bit.
And Anderson, I was thinking back to what Jake Tapper was just talking about, to now see President Bush 43 as the patriarch of the family. When Jake and I were covering then Governor Bush and the campaign in 2000, and John was referencing earlier work as a journalist he'd done where, George W. Bush was kind of an enforcer in the family, a fierce protector of his dad, very defensive of his dad, his legacy, and involved in politics that way before he'd kind of gotten his life together to the point where you could see his own political future. And to see him travel over time to this day, so emotional, as it was for President Bush 43 when he returned home to Midland, Texas, on the last day of his presidency, but now to pick up the mantle for his father as the patriarch of the family and of all of these years of service. It's quite a journey for him, and you can see him really wearing it with a lot of emotion today.
I felt, Anderson, today that this was not only moving for the Bush family, but for everyone there, but more importantly, for the country, for people across the country. This nation is hungry for inspiration. And I think they found that today. And the Bush family, in many ways, I think has been placed on a higher pedestal than they have been in recent years. You remember before Jeb ran, Barbara was telling people, the country is Bushed out. And it seemed that way. I think it was one of the reasons he didn't get the nomination. But nonetheless, I think today people are looking at the character and looking at George H.W. Bush and the whole family in a different light, in a positive, very positive light.
I was with members of the family last night, and they were really looking forward to this being a celebration and not a cry fest, and as they would put it. And I think they've got to be really pleased with the way it went today. This was a spectacular send-off, and I think they planned it that way, and it was beautifully executed. And I think President Bush would have been uncomfortable, as Jake was saying, too much about me. But I think it has his fingerprints all over it, and they've got to be thrilled with it.
Tim?
A week after the 1992 election, President Bush sat with Ann Simpson, Senator Simpson's wife, and had a very deep and difficult and loving conversation. And he wrote in his diary that night, he felt rejected by the baby boom generation. He felt disconnected. And he wrote, values, duty, country, service, honor, decency, all the things I really believe. We saw all of those things highlighted today, and it is a great thing for our country, and we desperately need that.
Does it have a lasting impact beyond?
Well, you know, I'm an optimist, so don't ask me. I think if John Meacham is right, and John Meacham is the poet laureate of the Bush family, but in many ways he's the historian laureate among presidential historians. If he's right, and I think he is, that's part of the American creed, so it doesn't go away.
The question is short-term or long-term. How are we having this conversation? In the short term, there are things about to happen that will test your optimism, in the sense that we're going now into a spending fight, a government shutdown fight that includes the border wall, which is something we have seen the president fight fiercely for and the Democrats fight fiercely against. So partisanship is just around the corner. We're at a key moment, some people think, getting to the top of the pyramid that is the Mueller investigation. If you're looking for bipartisanship, people coming together in that moment, I would just simply say not likely to happen. However, I think the longer term arc, to the people who have to make the big choices come January, what do they take away from today? We talked about this when Senator McCain died. Would it be a bipartisan moment? It lasted seconds or maybe a day or two. Nancy Pelosi may become Speaker. The Democrats will take power in the House. President Trump now has to decide, how do I navigate in this new world? His instinct is to fight. His instinct is to do combat from 6 a.m. on Twitter, until the end of the day. But is there a reassessment? Don't know. Wouldn't bet on it. But there is a moment here where everybody who has power and makes choices, from the president to the Democratic leadership to the Republicans who just got their you-know-what's kicked in Congress trying to decide what comes next, this is a moment of choices. We'll see which choice they make.
You know, John, what you say is everybody watching this, especially of a younger generation, the wrong thing to take away is that this is an ode to a bygone era. That's the wrong thing. The truth is that these values endure, they stand up, and the reason they're celebrated is because it's what is our American public and political life, and it is possible for it to endure. It's a tough media climate, tough political climate. We're so divided in lots of ways, but I think the pageantry of today was the enduring pageantry.
I think quickly, I know David wants to jump in quick, to the point that the Bushes have become a pariah within the Republican Party. California often tells us things the country's about to go through early, because it is so big, because it is so diverse, because it is so interesting. The environmental movement, California first, later the rest of the country. So many things. The anti-tax movement. Even in the days of Pete Wilson, the anti-immigration movement, he held power. That was the California Republican Party briefly. The Republican Party just got wiped out in California. Why? A lack of decency, a lack of common ground, a lack of treatment of immigrants with respect. And so what decisions do the other Republicans make at this moment? Are they going to stay on Team Trump to the end, or do they start thinking about the Republican Party after Trump? And the people who came to power in Orange County, for example, during the Bush years, in the Bush Republican Party, who want at least a path to legal status, if not a path to citizenship, for example, who don't mind having a drink or a dinner and have a conversation with a Democrat. Those people are gone. And so what lesson will the Republican Party learn from what just happened to it in California, in suburban America? Is there a short term we have to stick to Trump, or do they start to have a reassessment? That's one of the many choices that are about to happen.
Yeah, but I want to come back to this, David. I agree with you. The values are still out there, but we've been slipping away. This generation, the World War II generation, increasingly seems like from a vanished world. Yeah. And what's encouraging is that a lot of people in the younger generation today, I think, are like the new people elected to Congress. There's a lot of idealism in that group.
And a lot of veterans now.
A lot of veterans in that group. There are a lot of people who want to push back on both sides of the aisle, and that is what is from watching and listening to what George H.W. represented.
Well, and also today, Bush 43, what was striking to me is he reread a part of his father's inaugural address. Yeah. And in his father's inaugural address, his father said, we cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must also give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and town better than he found it. And that may be what the local organizing is about now that you're talking about, David, that this isn't bygone. It's different. It's just got to be different.
It's a struggle.
But it's a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. And, you know, the Bush name has been a pariah in the 2016 campaign, certainly. And no more, I think, after this. But I think the values are the values of this nation, and the pendulum swings back and forth, always.
I went early yesterday morning over to the Capitol just by myself to pay my respects. And as you come back out, they had these tables of notebooks for people to leave messages for the family and sign their names. And so I went over to the table, and somebody ahead of me, was clearly a young kid, had written, George W.H. Bush was a great man. We should remember him.
Right.
And that's my hope, is that young people will remember this, and that all of this is soaking in, and it'll have effects for a long time in ways we may not ever know.
You know, today was a day when we were reminded of the importance of faith to the Bushes, to the Bush family, and to George H.W. Bush. I think the challenge now is whether faith leads to selfishness or selflessness. I don't think it's a matter of politics. It's a matter of a sense of community, and we were reminded that community can also be associated with power and ambition, that he could be both ambitious and a man of community who believed in a community.
I think another lesson is that the caliber of the people who were attracted to this president and this man. Mary Kate was a young staffer in the White House. I was talking to Nick Burns the other day, who served 27 years in the United States government, the Foreign Service, Democrats and Republicans, you know, who was a kid on the National Security Council in those days back in the Bush administration. It's not just President Trump. We talk a lot about how President Trump is having trouble attracting quality people into the government, and that's certainly true. And in part, that's because of how he conducts himself. In part, it's because he's such a different Republican that some establishment Republicans don't want to come in. But the quality of the people who are in public service has declined pre-Trump as well. And I think that's a challenge for both parties, is to get younger people. I have, you know, millennials myself who they don't think government can do much. They haven't seen government in their lifetime do much that they think is worthwhile. And so how do you get younger people to want to be in public service so that when you have, if you looked at the rows, the 3,000 people in there, no disrespect, take away the politicians, the people who worked, and we went through this with Senator Kennedy as well, attracted young, talented people who went on to populate this town and run for office themselves and get into public service. The part of the dynasties, the Bushes don't like it, of the Kennedy dynasty and the Bush dynasty is also a hell of a lot of really good people who have really good experience who continue in public service.
If I could say, in lieu of flowers, President Bush said, please donate to the Bush School, which is his vision for exactly that. They're trying to get it tuition free so that kids can go right into public service without all the debt.
I want to go back to Wolf and Jake. Wolf?
Special Mission 41 now beginning to taxi on the tarmac, the runway at Joint Base Andrews outside of Washington, D.C. This will be the last time that the 41st President of the United States will be aboard one of these presidential aircrafts, as this flight will take him and the entourage, the family, the friends who are aboard this presidential aircraft to Houston for continuing memorial service tomorrow morning, and then final burial at Texas A&M University, the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. Jake, you and I, we were both White House correspondents, and we spent a lot of quality time aboard Air Force One covering presidents of the United States.
And it's the last time that George H.W. Bush will be on a plane like that. As you mentioned, the last time that George H.W. Bush was in Washington, a town where he served for decades in various capacities, congressman, CIA director, RNC chief, vice president, president. It's the last time that a former Navy flyer will be in an airplane, having volunteered for that service at the age of 18 as World War II was just beginning for the United States right after Pearl Harbor. And I have to wonder, what else are we saying goodbye to here? Are we saying goodbye to this man, of course, but are we also saying goodbye to a particular kind of leader, a particular kind of Republican? conservative in principle, moderate in many different aspects, somebody who on a policy level believed in international institutions, whether the United Nations or NATO, somebody who believed in alliances, and as president, somebody who believed in working across the aisle as a president, dealing with the Democratic Congress, signing major pieces of legislation into law, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came to actually help.
The aircraft carrying the Bush family, carrying the former president, is on its way to Texas. It'll land at Ellington Field at around 5:30 p.m. It'll be greeted by about 300 people, some from the Houston Astros, from the Houston Rockets and players, people from MD Anderson Cancer Center, George Bush High School, a number of dignitaries. And there will be a burial, obviously, tomorrow. We want to just take a look at some of the key moments from the actual service itself. In particular, let's start with some of the remarks made by Bush 43 when speaking about his father.
Through our tears, let us know the blessings of knowing and loving you, a great and noble man, the best father a son or daughter could have. And in our grief, let us smile knowing that Dad is hugging Robin and holding Mom's hand again.
And then you'll see he pats the casket as he walks by. I mean, it's rare to see kind of a display of emotion like that from, certainly from George W. Bush, really very poignant.
Very poignant, and I think he knew he was going to cry at some point in this. And what was so poignant about his eulogy was it was about a dad. It was about a father. It was about a personal relationship, and we've all talked about this over the years, how they had the difficulty when Bush became president, and he was doing some things that his father did not approve of, but his father held back and just gave him, as he pointed out, unconditional love. Once they were both out of office, their relationship softened a bit, and they could talk president to president. And Bush wrote a book about his father. He painted his father's portrait, and they became closer and closer. And I think, you know, for any child to give a eulogy for a parent is difficult. The world was watching.
And George, forgive me, George H.W. Bush, he was the kinder, gentler man. But
yes.
You have to also be fair, and in the context, he ran some pretty tough campaigns.
Right.
And what he did normally is that he was the kinder, gentler face, and he had people who did that for him. He had Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes in the 88 campaign. He had George W. in all of his campaigns. Yeah. I remember David mentioned the 2000 campaign. I covered the 1988 campaign first, and then the 1992 campaign. And I was with Governor Dukakis mostly in 88 and Governor Clinton mostly in 92, both against George H.W. Bush. I had a few interesting conversations with George W. Bush in those campaigns. He didn't like some of the things that I had written. I worked for the Associated Press in those days.
And he would let you know.
He would let you know. He would let you know because he would let you know in language that cannot be repeated, even on not family-friendly television sometimes. But he was so, he held his dad in such reverence that he would he would come at you, and it was about his dad. You're questioning my dad. And it was dad and mother. Dad and mother is how they spoke. But then I remember in the 2000 campaign, again, I was mostly, in that campaign, mostly covering Vice President Gore, but I came out in the Bush plane for a few days, and he had Karen Hughes bring me up on the plane, and he looked at me, W said, remember, just want to make sure, he said, we're good, right? Because he remembered those other campaigns. But he was his dad's enforcer. And you forget that about George W. Bush. You're reminded of it when he was around the White House so much. 8 years of Ronald Reagan, 4 years of his dad's presidency, that it's part of the family. It's literally, the White House is literally in their blood.
But he's also an emotional guy, 43, a really emotional guy. You know, I remember telling him when I was covering him that I cried at my wedding, and he said, that's a good thing. You know, I was the same way. And I remember September 12, 2001, when he was in the Oval Office and noticeably crying, saying he was an emotional guy, and that, you know, when he thinks about the children who've lost parents on 9/11, that it really got to him. And so, like the story that was told about his father who encountered the leukemia patients in Krakow who cried and had a sense that, you know, the media doesn't need to see me weeping, seeing their leader weep. I think President George W. Bush has always thought about that in these moments, these very public moments when the whole world is watching. And they were again today, but it was a more intimate moment where he could give himself some room to be the son.
He actually spoke about that in an interview we played just the other day. I don't know if it was 60 Minutes or it was on CNN, where he talked about giving a speech at the 9/11 memorial, at the cathedral, at the service, and not wanting to cry, and making sure he didn't in front of, because he didn't think America needed their leader crying in a moment like that. And when he sat down, then his father reached over and patted his hand.
And this is a different kind of moment, right? I mean, these children have lost both parents in a very short period of time. They've lost their mother, they've lost their father, they've lost their moorings in many ways, even though they're adults. Your parents are still your moorings. And I think that at the end of the speech, when he said, you know, his father would be back with his mother holding her hand and back with Robin, it was just too much for him, because I'm sure in a way he's spoken with his father about it. I mean, there were this is something that Bush 41 believed in deeply and told people apparently towards the end of his life, that this is what he envisioned. And so I think that's what 43 wanted to envision for him as well.
And isn't it lovely too? I mean, 94 years old, right? He was 94, right? An amazing life, but also for the son, right? This patriarch, he got to speak to his father and hear the last words spoken, "I love you too." It's such a beautiful parting. And you know, for those of us who have lost a parent and who have had a beautiful parting, you carry that with you, and we all get to be part of that. And as I say, we can't identify with what it's like to be a president or the son of a president, but we all can think about this in terms of our own parents and our own relationships.
The Bushes are good people. There are people out there who, they're not perfect people, so there are people out there, I'll say that, and they'll say, well, what about the Willie Horton ad, or whether it's George H.W. Bush, or what about George W. Bush and, you know, mistakes. I'm not saying they're perfect people, but if you every interaction with you, they're just good people. They're good people. They send notes, they ask how you're doing, they check in on the families and friends. To hear Brian Mulroney, I think, in the end, there are friendships, and it's true of all of them. It's not just, you know, we focus on now the departed, the late President H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush and Governor Jeb Bush. The three have been most in the public eye, but it's all of them. When you could see them after a period of years, even the ones who don't know me well at all, they just always have. They're just nice people. They're good people.
I particularly like the line from John Meacham's excellent eulogy when he said, "An imperfect man who is left behind a more perfect union."
Great line.
I thought that captured so much of him, because it's also true. It was really striking to watch George W. today, as it has been over the years. He has had such a struggle, you know, born to this family, born by this father, and he was trying to walk in his footsteps, and he never could quite succeed. You know, he went to Yale, and his father had been, you know, captain of the baseball team, first base, and George W. turned out to be a cheerleader. You know, and his father was the youngest pilot shot down in the Pacific in the war, and he, you know, joined the National Guard. And it was not exactly, you know, heroic to be defending the great state of Texas from the state of Oklahoma. You know, people sort of knew that. But he then evolved over time. And I think winning a second term was something his father had not done, but also having his own progress over time. He was very controversial, especially over Iraq. But I think he reached a peace with his father after he left the presidency, because he had done so much, and I think they had both come to terms with their relationship, and it was a lovely relationship toward the end. And he's now clearly I'm not sure you want to call him the patriarch, but he's clearly the leader of that family now.
I also think during the last campaign, Jeb Bush defended his father. Do you remember? There was a point on debate, you may remember better than I, where Jeb came out and said, "My father's the greatest man I ever knew," period. And because, you know, he was part of the dynasty and he was being attacked for just being someone whose turn it was to become president. And his father was criticized, and he just came out, Jeb just came out swinging about it.
You know, I'm really looking forward to hearing what George P. has to say tomorrow. He's Jeb's oldest son, oldest of all the grandchildren. And when you have that book ended with James Baker, his best friend, I think today was going to be, as you guys were saying, the more presidential of the 2 days. And even just the two churches. The cathedral is so soaring and intimidating, and the acoustics are such that you drop a pin and you can hear it just about in the whole place. So that's why people are sort of afraid to even whisper. And I think that's what we saw, some of the people sitting there not having a big chatty time. And I think St. Martin's is much more intimate. The ceiling's not so high. There's carpeting. You know, you can have a little side conversation with people. And I think it's going to be a very different feel tomorrow, and much more personal, not as presidential. And I think that's going to be an interesting sidelight. But going back to Jeb and his oldest son and what they have to say, we heard from 43's children, and Neil's 2 daughters today. And now we'll hear from Jeb's tomorrow.
It is amazing, though, the contrast between, you know, sort of the national security team that George H.W., I mean, you have Jim Baker, you know, Scowcroft, you had all these people. It's just a reminder, again, of a different way of running a White House.
Well, I was going to say that George H.W. Bush did not want a team of rivals. He wanted people who liked each other, respected each other, but they didn't always agree with each other. One of the key things about that White House is that you had Cheney on one side and you had Baker on another, and they rarely agreed on foreign policy. So it was Bush who had to make the call. You know, his son was known for saying, "I'm the decider," but George H.W. Bush, he was the decider. That was what he had to do with that particular group of very responsible and professional men.
You know, it's interesting. There's so much talk about leadership today, and what a great leader President Bush 41 was, and how important that was as a feeling for Americans, to feel like they were well led and respected on the world stage. George W. Bush, as a candidate, talked about a humble foreign policy. 9/11 happens, it becomes a much more aggressive foreign policy, very much in contrast to that sense of humility and caution that his father had on the world stage. A lot of Americans became very uncomfortable with how America looked and felt on the world stage. So the contrast in leadership, as we see from the father to the son, in the context of that leadership of the world, which was really talked about a lot today.
We've got to take a quick break. The service, emotional, filled with testimony to a life. The 41st president is en route back to Texas, back to his home. He's going home. He'll be landing at Ellington Field around 5:30 this afternoon, and the burial will be tomorrow. There were a number of moments that we want to talk about during the church service. Several of them we put together. You could say there are allusions to President Trump, or perhaps references to, or just kind of hints at. Well, I will leave it up to you whether that's directly referencing President Trump. But here's a number of comments that people have been talking about.
He never hated anyone. He knew what his mother and my mother always knew. Hatred corrodes the container it's carried in. The most decent and honorable person I ever met was my friend George Bush, one of nature's noble men.
I believe it will be said that no occupant of the Oval Office was more courageous, more principled, and more honorable than George Herbert Walker Bush.
His life code, as he said, was tell the truth, don't blame people, be strong, do your best, try hard, forgive, stay the course.
Just some of the comments. I mean, hearing Meacham say, tell the truth, don't blame people, do your best, forgive, stay the course.
It sounds anti-Trump, but it isn't necessarily, because what it is reminding us of the world in which we now live, which is very different, and the world Bush chose to create, and the life he chose to live. And so all of these adjectives, I mean, he was compared to Lincoln. I believe it was Meacham who said, for Lincoln and Bush, both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, choose hope over fear. Your mind naturally goes to...
I suppose, though, in any description of the life of the 41st president, it is going to stand in stark contrast, because, I mean, everything about the 41st president, everything he believed in, is pretty much antithetical to the current president.
Right. The way he wore the presidency, how he felt the presidency was bigger than himself, which are not qualities that you would assign to President Trump. Who thinks of himself more than he thinks about the presidency, or or the job being bigger than himself, or his self-interest. Those contrasts are clear. The way he's conducted his politics. Look, there were early signs of the kind of populism in the politics of George H.W. Bush. He encountered it with Ross Perot. He encountered it with Pat Buchanan. He didn't hold up particularly well under it. And that was part of a reality that he was coming to see, that he had to kind of move beyond. You know, that point of President Bush 43 saying that his dad always told him that that failure was part of living a full life, but it shouldn't define your life. And it's the fact that he specifically wouldn't let it define his public life after he lost to Bill Clinton that I think was so ennobling for his legacy, too.
And the way he adopted Clinton.
Yeah.
After you know, he lost to him, and the way the way their friendship.
And again, this whole idea of the club, right? The idea that Trump, you know, was there, he was seated, he didn't speak. There was all this moments of discomfort. Again, I said it a few hours ago. I wonder if for Trump, being in that moment for the first time, realizing he really is part of this and will be part of this in life, in the presidency, and in death, whether that made him think about any of these things.
Sure you can hope. Sure
Yep.
did. You know, I have to say, I interviewed, when I made 41 on 41, the documentary about President Bush,